Hello friends, and welcome to tonight's edition of Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. If you enjoy this narration, I would encourage you to subscribe so you will be notified when a new bedtime story is ready for you. And so, it is time to unwind. Find yourself a place where you can get comfortable and relax. Once you have settled in, take a deep breath. Your day has come to an end. There is nothing else you have to do today but listen to these stories and fall asleep. And so, let us begin these stories. The Fillmore Elderberries. I expected as much, said Timothy Robinson. His tone brought the blood into Ellis Duncan's face. The lad opened his lips quickly, as if for an angry retort, but as quickly closed them again with a set of firmness, oddly like Timothy Robinson's own. When I heard that lazy, worthless father of yours was dead, I expected you and your mother would be looking to me for help, Timothy Robinson went on harshly. But you're mistaken if you think I'll give it. You've no claim on me, even if your father was my half-brother. No claim at all. And I'm not noted for charity. Timothy Robinson smiled grimly. It was very true that he was far from being noted for charity. His neighbors called him close and near. Some even went so far as to call him a miserly skinflint. But this was not true. It was, however, undeniable that Timothy Robinson kept a tight clutch on his purse strings. And although he sometimes gave liberally enough to any cause which really appealed to him, such causes were few and far between. I'm not asking for charity, Uncle Timothy, said Alice quietly. He passed over the slur at his father in silence, deeply as he felt it, for, alas, he knew that it was only too true. I expect to support my mother by hard and honest work, and I'm not asking you for work on the ground of our relationship. I heard you wanted a hired man, and I have to come to you, as I should have gone to any other man about whom I had heard it, to ask you to hire me. Yes, I do want a man, said Uncle Timothy dryly. A man. Not a half-grown boy of 14, not worth his salt. I want somebody able and willing to work. Again, Alice flushed deeply, and again he controlled himself. I am willing to work, Uncle Timothy, and I think you would find me able also if you would try me. I'd work for less than a man's wage at first, of course. You won't work for any sort of wages for me, interrupted Timothy Robinson decidedly. I tell you plainly that I won't hire you. You're the wrong man's son for that. Your father was lazy and incompetent and, worst of all, untrustworthy. I did try to help him once, and all I got was loss and ingratitude. I want none of this kind around my place. I don't believe in you, so you may as well take yourself off, Alice. I've no more time to waste. Alice took himself off, his ears tingling. As he walked homeward, his thoughts were very bitter. All Uncle Timothy had said about his father was true, and Alice realized what account it was against him in his efforts to obtain employment. Nobody wanted to be bothered with old Sam Duncan's son, though nobody had been so brutally outspoken as his Uncle Timothy. Sam Duncan and Timothy Robinson had been half-brothers. Sam, the older, had been the son of Mrs. Robinson's former marriage. Never were two lads more dissimilar. Sam was a lazy, shiftless fellow, deserving all the hard things that came to be said of him. He would not work, and nobody could depend on him, but he was a handsome lad, with rather taking ways in his youth, and at first people had liked him better than the close, blunt, industrious Timothy. Their mother had died in their childhood, but Mr. Robinson had been fond of Sam, and the boy had a good home. When he was 22 and Timothy 18, Mr. Robinson had died very suddenly, leaving no will. Everything he possessed went to Timothy. Sam immediately left. He said he would not stay there to be bossed by Timothy. He rented a little house in the village, married a girl far too good for him, and started in to support himself and his wife by day's work. He had lounged, borrowed, and shirked through life. Once Timothy Robinson, perhaps moved by pity for Sam's wife and baby, had hired him for a year at better wages than most hired men received in Dalrymple. Sam idled through a month of it, then got offended, and left in the middle of haying. Timothy Robinson washed his hands off him after that. When Alice was 14, Sam Duncan died, after a lingering illness of a year. During this time, the family were kept by the charity of pitying neighbors, for Alice could not be spared from attendance on his father to make any attempt at earning money. Mrs. Duncan was a fragile little woman, worn out with her hard life, and not strong enough to wait on her husband alone. When Sam Duncan was dead and buried, Alice straightened his shoulders and took counsel with himself. He must earn a livelihood for his mother and himself, and he must begin at once. He was tall and strong for his age, and had a fairly good education, his mother having determinedly kept him at school when he had pleaded to be allowed to go to work. He had always been a quiet fellow, and nobody in Dalrymple knew much about him. But they knew all about his father, and nobody would hire Alice unless he were willing to work for a pittance that would barely clothe him. Alice had not gone to his Uncle Timothy until he had lost all hope of getting a place elsewhere. Now this hope too had gone. It was nearly the end of June, and everybody who wanted help had secured it. Look where he would, Alice could see no prospect of employment. If I could only get a chance, he thought miserably. I know I'm not idle or lazy. I know I can work. If I could get a chance to prove it. He was sitting on the fence of the Fillmore Elderberry pasture as he said it, having taken a shortcut across the fields. This pasture was rather noted in Dalrymple. Originally a mellow and fertile field, it had been almost ruined by a persistent, luxuriant growth of elderberry bushes. Old Thomas Fillmore had at first tried to conquer them by mowing them down, in the dark of the moon. But the elderberries did not seem to mind either moon or mowing, and flourished alike in all the quarters. For the past 2 years, old Thomas had given up the contest, and the elderberries had it all their own sweet way. Thomas Fillmore, a bent old man with a shrewd, nutcracker face, came through the bushes while Alice was sitting on the fence. "Howdy, Alice. seen anything of my spotted calves? I've been looking for 'em for over an hour." "No, I haven't seen any calves, but a good many might be in this pasture, without being visible to the naked eye," said Alice with a smile. Old Thomas shook his head ruefully. "Them elders have been too many for me," he said. "Did you ever see a worse-looking place? You'd hardly believe that 20 years ago there wasn't a better piece of land in Dalrymple than this lot, would ye? Such grass as grew here." "The soil must be as good as ever if anything had a chance to grow on it," said Alice. "Couldn't those elders be rooted out?" "It'd be a back-breaking job, but I reckon it could be done if anyone had the muscle and patience and time to tackle it. I haven't the first at my age, and my hired man hasn't the last, and nobody would do it for what I could afford to pay." "What will you give me if I undertake to clean the elders out of this field for you, Mr. Fillmore?" asked Alice quietly. Old Thomas looked at him with a surprised face, which gradually reverted to its original shrewdness when he saw that Alice was in earnest. "You must be hard up for a job," he said. "I am," was Alice's laconic answer. "Well, let me see." Old Thomas calculated carefully. He never paid a cent more for anything than he could help, and was noted for hard bargaining. "I'll give ye $16 if ye clean out the whole field," he said at length. Alice looked at the pasture. He knew something about cleaning out elderberry brush, and he also knew that $16 would be very poor pay for it. Most of the elders were higher than a man's head, with big roots, thicker than his wrist, running deep into the ground. "It's worth more, Mr. Fillmore," he said. "Not to me," responded old Thomas dryly. "I've plenty more land, and I'm an old fellow without any sons. I ain't going to pay out money for the benefit of some stranger who'll come after me. You can take it or leave it at $16. Alice shrugged his shoulders. He had no prospect of anything else, and $16 were better than nothing. "Very well, I'll take it," he said. "Well now, look here," said old Thomas shrewdly. "I'll expect you to do the work thoroughly, young man. Them roots ain't to be cut off, remember? They'll have to be dug out, and I'll expect you to finish the job if you undertake it too, and not drop it halfway through if you get the chance for a better one. I'll finish with your elderberries before I leave them," promised Alice. Alice went to work the next day. His first move was to chop down all the brush and cart it into heaps for burning. This took 2 days, and was comparatively easy work. The third day, Alice tackled the roots. By the end of the forenoon, he had discovered just what cleaning out an elderberry pasture meant. But he set his teeth and resolutely persevered. During the afternoon, Timothy Robinson, whose farm adjoined the Fillmore place, wandered by and halted with a look of astonishment at the sight of Alice, busily engaged in digging and tearing out huge, tough, stubborn elder roots. The boy did not see his uncle, but worked away with a vim and vigor that were not lost on the latter. "He never got that muscle from Sam," reflected Timothy. "Sam would have fainted at the mere thought of stumping elders. Perhaps I've been mistaken in the boy. Well, well, we'll see if he holds out." Yes, Alice did hold out. The elderberries tried to hold out too, but they were no match for the lad's perseverance. It was a hard piece of work, however, and Alice never forgot it. Week after week he toiled in the hot summer sun, digging, cutting, and dragging out roots. The job seemed endless, and his progress each day seemed discouragingly slow. He had expected to get through in a month, but he soon found it would take 2. Frequently, Timothy Robinson wandered by and looked at the increasing pile of roots and the slowly extending stretch of cleared land. But he never spoke to Alice and made no comment on the matter to anybody. One evening, when the field was about half done, Alice went home, more than usually tired. It had been a very hot day. Every bone and muscle in him ached. He wondered dismally if he would ever get to the end of that wretched elderberry field. When he reached home, Jacob Green from Westdale was there. Jacob lost no time in announcing his errand. "My hired boy's broke his leg, and I must fill his place right off. Somebody referred me to you. Guess I'll try you. $12 a month, board and lodging. What say?" For a moment, Alice's face flushed with delight. $12 a month and permanent employment. Then he remembered his promise to Mr. Fillmore. For a moment he struggled with the temptation. Then he mastered it. Perhaps the discipline of his many encounters with those elderberry roots helped him to do so. "I'm sorry, Mr. Green," he said reluctantly. "I'd like to go, but I can't. I promised Mr. Fillmore that I'd finish cleaning up his elderberry pasture when I'd once begun it, and I shan't be through for a month yet." "Well, I'd see myself turning down a good offer for old Tom Fillmore," said Jacob Green. "It isn't for Mr. Fillmore, it's for myself," said Alice steadily. "I promised, and I must keep my word." Jacob drove away grumblingly. On the road, he met Timothy Robinson and stopped to relate his grievances. It must be admitted that there were times during the next month when Alice was tempted to repent having refused Jacob Green's offer. But at the end of the month the work was done, and the Fillmore Elderberry pasture was an elderberry pasture no longer. All that remained of the elders, root and branch, was piled into a huge heap, ready for burning. "And I'll come up and set fire to it when it's dry enough," Alice told Mr. Fillmore. "I claim the satisfaction of that." "You've done the job thoroughly," said old Thomas. "There's your $16, and every cent of it was earned, if ever money was. I'll say that much for you. There ain't a lazy bone in your body. If you ever want a recommendation, just you come to me." As Alice passed Timothy Robinson's place on the way home, that worthy himself appeared, strolling down his lane. "Ah, Alice," he said, speaking to his nephew for the first time since the interview 2 months before. "So you finished with your job?" "Yes, sir." "Got your $16, I suppose? It was worth 4 times that. Old Tom cheated you. You were foolish not to have gone to Green when you had the chance." "I'd promised Mr. Fillmore to finish with his pasture, sir." "Huh. Well, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know. Harvest will be on next week. I may get in somewhere as an extra hand for a spell." "Alice," said his uncle abruptly, after a moment's silence, "I'm going to discharge my man. He's no earthly good. Will you take his place? I'll give you $15 a month and found." Alice stared at Timothy Robinson. I thought you told me that you had no place for my father's son, he said slowly. I've changed my mind. I've seen how you went at that elderberry job. Great snakes, there couldn't be a better test for anybody than rooting out them things. I know you can work. When Jacob Green told me why you'd refused his offer, I knew you could be depended on. You come to me, and I'll do well by you. I've no kith or kin of my own except you. And look here, Alice, I'm tired of hiring housekeepers. Will your mother come up and live with us and look after things a bit? I've a good girl, and she won't have to work hard. But there must be somebody at the head of a household. She must have a good headpiece, for you have inherited good qualities from someone, and goodness knows it wasn't from your father. Uncle Timothy, said Alice respectfully but firmly, I'll accept your offer gratefully, and I'm sure Mother will too. But there's one thing I must say. Perhaps my father deserves all you say of him. But he is dead, and if I come to you, it must be with the understanding that nothing more is ever to be said against him. Timothy Robinson smiled, a queer, twisted smile that yet had a hint of affection and comprehension in it. Very well, he said. I'll never cast his shortcomings up to you again. Come to me, and if I find you always as industrious and reliable as you've proved yourself to be negotiating them elders, I'll most likely forget that you ain't my son some of these days. A redeeming sacrifice. The dance at Byron Lyall's was in full swing. Tough Leclerc, the best fiddler in 3 counties, was enthroned on the kitchen table, and from the glossy brown violin, which his grandfather brought from Grand Pré, was conjuring music which made even stiff old Aunt Femi want to show her steps. Around the kitchen sat a row of young men and women, and the open sitting-room doorway was crowded with the faces of non-dancing guests who wanted to watch their sets. An 8-hand reel had just been danced, and the girls, giddy from the much swinging of the final figure, had been led back to their seats. Mattie Lyall came out with a dipper of water and sprinkled the floor, from which a fine dust was rising. Toph's violin purred under his hands as he waited for the next set to form. The dancers were slow about it. There was not the rush for the floor that there had been earlier in the evening, for the supper table was now spread in the dining room, and most of the guests were hungry. "Fill up there, boys," shouted the fiddler impatiently. "Bring out your gals for the next set." After a moment, Paul King led out Joanne Shelley from the shadowy corner where they had been sitting. They had already danced several sets together. Joanne had not danced with anybody else that evening. As they stood together under the light from the lamp on the shelf above them, many curious and disapproving eyes watched them. Connor Mitchell, who had been standing in the open outer doorway with the moonlight behind him, turned abruptly on his heel and went out. Paul King leaned his head against the wall and watched the watchers with a smiling, defiant face as they waited for the set to form. He was a handsome fellow with the easy, winning ways that women love. His hair curled in bronze masses about his head. His dark eyes were long and drowsy and laughing. There was a swarthy bloom on his round cheeks, and his lips were as red and beguiling as a girl's. A bad egg was Paul King, with a bad past and a bad future. He was shiftless and drunken. Ugly tales were told of him. Not a man in Lyle's house that night but grudged him the privilege of standing up with Joanne Shelley. Joanne was a slight, blossom-like girl in white, looking much like the pale, sweet-scented house rose she wore in her dark hair. Her face was colorless and young, very pure and softly curved. She had wonderfully sweet, dark blue eyes, and generally dropped down with notably long black lashes. There were many showier girls in the groups around her, but none half so lovely. She made all the rose-cheeked beauties seem coarse and overblown. She left in Paul's clasp the hand by which he had led her out on the floor. Now and then he shifted his gaze from the faces before him to hers. When he did, she always looked up and they exchanged glances as if they had been utterly alone. 3 other couples gradually took the floor, and the reel began. Joanne drifted through the figures with the grace of a wind-blown leaf. Paul danced with rollicking abandon, seldom taking his eyes from Joanne's face. When the last mad whirl was over, Joanne's brother came up and told her in an angry tone to go into the next room and dance no more, since she would dance with only one man. Joanne looked at Paul. That look meant that she would do as he, and none other, told her. Paul nodded easily. He did not want any fuss just then, and the girl went obediently into the room. As she turned from him, Paul coolly reached out his hand and took the rose from her hair. Then, with a triumphant glance around the room, he went out. The autumn night was very clear and chill, with a faint, moaning wind blowing up from the northeast over the sea that lay shimmering before the door. Out beyond the cove, the boats were nodding and curtsying on the swell, and over the shore fields the great red star of the lighthouse flared out against the silvery sky. Paul, with a whistle, sauntered down the sandy lane, thinking of Joan. How mightily he loved her, he, Paul King, who had made a mock of so many women and had never loved before. Ah, and she loved him. She had never said so in words, but eyes and tones had said it. She, Joan Shelley, the pick and pride of the harbor girls, whom so many men had wooed, winning their trouble for their pains. He had won her. She was his, and his only for the asking. His heart was seething with pride and triumph and passion as he strode down to the shore and flung himself on the cold sand in the black shadow of Michael Brown's beached boat. Byron Lyle, a grizzled elderly man, half farmer, half fisherman, and Maxwell Holmes, the prospect schoolteacher, came up to the boat presently. Paul lay softly and listened to what they were saying. He was not troubled by any sense of dishonor. Honor was something Paul King could not lose, since it was something he had never possessed. They were talking of him and Joan. What a shame that a girl like Joan Shelley should throw herself away on a man like that, Holmes said. Byron Lyle removed the pipe he was smoking and spat reflectively at his shadow. Darn shame, he agreed. That girl's life will be ruined if she marries him. Plumb ruined. and marry him she will. He's bewitched her, darned if I can understand it. A dozen better men have wanted her. Connor Mitchell for one, and he's an honest, steady fellow, with a good home to offer her. If King had left her alone, she'd have taken Connor. She used to like him well enough, but that's all over. She's infatuated with King, the worthless scamp. She'll marry him and be sorry for it to her last day. He is bad, clear through, and always will be. Why, look you, teacher, most men put up a bit when they're courting a girl, no matter how wild they've been, and will be again. Paul hasn't. It hasn't made any difference. He was dead drunk, night afore last, at the Harbour Head, and he hasn't done a stroke of work for a month. And yet, Joan Shelley'll take him. What are her people thinking of to let her go with him? Asked Holmes. She hasn't any but her brother. He's against Paul, of course, but it won't matter. The girl's fancy's caught, and she'll go her own gait to ruin. Ruin, I'll tell ya. If she marries that handsome ne'er-do-well, she'll be a wretched woman all her days, and none to pity her. The two moved away then, and Paul lay motionless, face downward on the sand, his lips pressed against Joan's sweet, crushed rose. He felt no anger over Byron Lyall's unsparing condemnation. He knew it was true, every word of it. He was a worthless scamp, and always would be. He knew that perfectly well. It was in his blood. None of his race had ever been respectable, and he was worse than them all. He had no intention of trying to reform, because he could not, and because he did not even want to. He was not fit to touch Joan's hand, yet he had meant to marry her. But to spoil her life, would it do that? Yes, it surely would. And if he were out of the way, taking his baleful charm out of her life, Connor Mitchell might, and doubtless would, win her yet, and give her all he could not. The man suddenly felt his eyes wet with tears. He had never shed a tear in his daredevil life before, but they came hot and stinging now. Something he had never known or thought of before entered into his passion and purified it. He loved Joan. Did he love her well enough to stand aside and let another take the sweetness and grace that was now his own? Did he love her well enough to save her from the poverty-stricken, shamed life she must lead with him? Did he love her better than himself? I ain't fit to think of her, he groaned. I never did a decent thing in my life, as they say. But how can I give her up? God, how can I? He lay still a long time after that, until the moonlight crept around the boat and drove away the shadow. Then he got up and went slowly down to the water's edge with Joan's rose, all wet with his unaccustomed tears in his hands. Slowly and reverently he plucked off the petals and scattered them on the ripples, where they drifted lightly off like fairy shallops on moonshine. When the last one had fluttered from his fingers, he went back to the house and hunted up Captain Alec Matheson, who was smoking his pipe in a corner of the veranda and watching the young folk dancing through the open door. The two men talked together for some time. When the dance broke up and the guests straggled homeward, Paul sought Joan. Rob Shelley had his own girl to see home, and relinquished the guardianship of his sister with a scowl. Paul strode out of the kitchen and down the steps at the side of Joan, smiling with his usual daredeviltry. He whistled noisily all the way up the lane. "Great little dance," he said. "My last in Prospect for a spell, I guess." "Why?" asked Joan wonderingly. "Oh, I'm going to take a run down to South America in Matheson's schooner. Lord knows when I'll come back. This old place has got too deadly dull to suit me. I'm going to look for something livelier." Joan's lips turned ashen under the fringes of her white fascinator. She trembled violently and put one of her small brown hands up to her throat. You are not coming back?" she said faintly. "Not likely. I'm pretty well tired of Prospect, and I haven't got anything to hold me here. Things will be livelier down south." Joan said nothing more. They walked along the spruce-fringed roads, where the moonbeams laughed down through the thick, softly swaying boughs. Paul whistled, one rollicking tune after another. The girl bit her lips and clenched her hands. He cared nothing for her. He had been making a mock of her as of others. Hurt pride and wounded love fought each other in her soul. Pride conquered. She would not let him, or anyone, see that she cared. She would not care. At her gate, Paul held out his hand. "Well, goodbye, Joan. I'm sailing tomorrow, so I won't see you again. Not for years, likely. You will be some sober old married woman when I come back to Prospect, if I ever do." "Goodbye," said Joan steadily. She gave him her cold hand and looked calmly into his face without quailing. She had loved him with all her heart, but now a fatal scorn of him was already mingling with her love. He was what they said he was, a scamp without principle or honor. Paul whistled himself out of the Shelley lane and over the hill. Then he flung himself down under the spruces, crushed his face into the spicy frosted ferns, and had his black hour alone. But when Captain Alec's schooner sailed out of the harbor the next day, Paul King was on board of her, the wildest and most hilarious of a wild and hilarious crew. Prospect people nodded their satisfaction. "Good riddance," they said. "Paul King is black to the core. He never did a decent thing in his life."